As highlighted in the last segment on Indiana's governor vetoing a bill protecting girls' sports, it isn't necessarily true that someone who is a Republican is a conservative. Now, another case in point, the announcement on Sunday by right-wing pundit Dave Rubin about babies he is expecting through surrogacy with his same-sex partner. All this begs the question, what does it mean to be a conservative? And how important is it to be conservative? Joining me now for this discussion is Dr. Carl Trueman, professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College. He's also the author of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important books written in recent years. And he's out with a new book titled Strange New World: How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. That book hit bookshelves today. So hustle to your local bookshelves or your local Amazon depot and pick it up. Dr. Trueman, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Great. Thanks for having me back on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it is truly one of the highlights of my week every time I get to talk to you. Now, I want to get into this Dave Rubin conversation, but before we do, bigger picture, you're out with a book today about, it's called Strange New World: How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. What point are you trying to make in that book?
Well, the book is, in some ways, it's a précis of the bigger book that you mentioned, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and an extension of some of the arguments there. And the basic point I'm trying to make is that to understand the dramatic changes in society, particularly the dramatic changes in how we understand ourselves, particularly relative to sexual identity, things like that, need to be said in a broader cultural context. The revolution seems to be happening very fast, but the causes for it really go back a long, long way. And understanding those causes helps us pause and respond to the situations we now find ourselves in.
You talk a lot about the importance of expressive individualism, that concept, especially as it relates to sexuality and the value that culture has given to the ability for someone to essentially do whatever they want sexually, provided, of course, the qualification is you're not hurting someone else. How did that become such an important value culturally?
It's a difficult story to tell in 30 seconds, but essentially what happened is over the last 300 years, we've granted more and more authority to our feelings, to our inner space. And we've come to see happiness as being constituted by our ability to express those inner feelings outwardly. And we've also come to focus upon happiness, meaning psychological contentment, a warm, fuzzy feeling inside, as being the primary point of human flourishing. Now, the sexual dimension of that has come in relatively late in the last 4 or 5 decades. But what modern society has done is it's taken that psychologized self, that psychologized notion of happiness, and taking a cue from Freud, really, said the most perfect way of achieving that happiness is sexual satisfaction.
Now, this is a point that you make in part in a column you've written this week for World Opinions, and I'll give a brief plug for World Opinions because World Opinions, it's a new project of World Magazine, which people are familiar with. It has brilliant writers like you and many others, and it has less brilliant writers like your illustrious guest host of Washington Watch. But Carl, the point that you make in the article is prompted by what happened with Dave Rubin. And some people may not be familiar with him. He's a right-wing commentator. He actually has a lot of good insight, wisdom, understanding of the left. He used to be on the left. He understands the risks of wokeness and leftism generally. But he also is a man who identifies as gay. He makes no bones about it. He's proud of it. And he made an announcement this week that he and his same-sex partner are expecting 2 children via surrogacy. A lot of people on the right, including a lot of social conservatives, were quick to congratulate him. What was your concern there?
Well, my concern is that the logic of gay surrogacy is essentially the logic of transgenderism. It's denying the biological nature of reproduction. It's denying the biological distinction between the sexes, and it's seeing our natural physical limits vis-a-vis male and female as something that can be technologically overcome. So it's an extremely revolutionary and iconoclastic attitude. It may be couched, as it was in Dave Rubin's announcement, in the aesthetics of traditional family. You had a picture of the happy couple holding up ultrasound scans for Twitter, for a Twitter post, that kind of thing. The aesthetics, the outward trappings were very traditional. But the inner core of what's going on is actually explosively revolutionary.
Because of that, why is it, do you think, that so many people who, if you had asked them in a vacuum, is it a good idea for people to rent wombs, to go through IVF, to have somebody else bear a child and then give it to other people, none of whom are it's going to be its biological mother, they would say, no, that's not a good idea. But why, when it's attached to someone they know and like, does it become something they publicly celebrate?
Well, on one level, you can sympathize with that as a person. Who wants other people to be unhappy? Who wants somebody to be miserable? That's really the air that we breathe in the culture we live in. It's the expressive individual culture that we find ourselves in at this point. And to cast aspersions on somebody else's happiness, to rain on their parade, seems mean-minded and small-minded. And I think that our instincts are to affirm somebody when they seem to be happy, they don't seem to be harming anybody else. We should affirm them. The problem is, of course, that gay surrogacy, on one level, I'm sure people are thinking, well, this is a private matter between Dave Rubin and his partner. Well, on one level it is, but on another level, it embodies a whole philosophy of gender and reproduction, and it embodies a whole philosophical attitude to what and who children are and what they are for.
Carl Trueman, what do you think the future would look like if literally everyone followed the example of Dave Rubin and his partner and had children created in test tubes, carried by other people, and then essentially adopted after they were born?
I think it would be highly problematic. We know that children have a desire to know who their biological parents are. We know that biology is powerful. And this is not, in saying this, I'm not casting aspersions on the love that any surrogate parents may have for a child born through surrogacy, or any parent may have for a child that they've adopted. But we know that the normal and natural way of having children is two people producing the child together and having a strong and powerful emotional and biological link to that child. So I think if we had a world where, say, everybody is produced by surrogacy, you attenuate the natural bond of parents to children. I don't know where that will lead, but I'm sure it will not be as good a world as the one that we live in, where natural childbirth is the primary means of producing children.
And that is a point that you make in your article this week, that this is not the only context in which surrogacy has been kind of glorified as a good thing, because other thinkers have thought this is a way to level the playing field for men and women in kind of the feminist debate, that what we need to do is take away the quote unquote disability that women have by being the vehicles through which life have to come into the world. We can level that if we just bring children into the world artificially. But there are consequences, aren't there, if we all decide that we have a different path than the one God created to bring people into the world. But again, I want to drill down a little bit further on why it is that conservatives, including Christian conservatives, have this instinct to applaud and cheer when someone we know, someone we like, something like this is happening. Do you think is it tribalism? Is it the sense that that's somebody that's on my team, so I'm going to support what he's doing? Or is it just this personal, I don't want to be a bad guy, I don't want to be mean?
I think it's a variety of factors. I think tribalism plays a part of it. We all tend to be a little more tolerant of the sins of the people that we like, as opposed to the sins of those we don't like. I think it's part of our culture that we want to affirm people in being happy. I think there's also that strong, I don't know how to describe it, maybe libertarian streak, where we look at Dave Rubin and think, well, what he's doing isn't harming anybody. What right have I got to judge? What right have I got to say, no, that's wrong? And that's not a necessarily incorrect feeling. We don't want to always be interfering in other people's lives. I think the point here is, though, that we've got to think more broadly about what's going on, that there are social ramifications of this kind of thing that need to be taken into account. One of them, of course, is, surrogacy creates a way of thinking about children, makes a way of imagining what children are that I think pushes them towards more being a commodity, pushes them towards existing for the happiness and the fulfillment of the parents. Now, hopefully children fulfill us and make us happy. That's, again, not a bad thing, but that's not the primary purpose of children, I don't think.
As a parent, most days children make us happy and fulfill us, but there are days when it is challenging to be sure. Now, one of the challenges about this situation and all of these situations when we're dealing with things like surrogacy and gay adoption is I have no doubt in my mind that somebody like Dave Rubin has the absolute best intentions, that his hopes and dreams for these children who are coming to the world are all good. And I have every belief that he intends to sacrifice, as all parents do, for their benefit. Why is that not enough?
It's not enough for the reasons I've sort of outlined, if you like. I think that having children is not just a private affair. How we conceptualize families, how we bring children into the world, how we treat children, how we think of children, what rights we grant to children, what status we see them as having, these are not matters of mere private concern. They're matters of pressing public concern and should be matters of pressing public policy. And I would say that the logic of gay adoption really leaves us with nothing to defend ourselves over against transgender ideology, for example. When we make the biological process of reproduction, when we make the male-female distinction, the male-female bond, when we make that very thin, attenuated, or we abolish it altogether, then we have no philosophical basis for opposing the most extreme excesses of the trans movement. Dave Rubin may not be wanting to go there, but the problem is, by using technology to overcome nature's limits on this front, we set a dangerous precedent for using technology to overcome nature's limits on all fronts.
Carl Trueman, I want to talk a little bit about the political kind of underpinnings of this conversation as well, because the article you wrote again in World Magazine this week is "Gay Conservatism is a Contradiction in Terms" is the headline. Now, this idea of gay conservatism, define that term for me. If you think it's a contradiction of terms, what do you mean by conservatism?
Well, that's part of the problem. I think there is no consensus today on what conservatism means. Does it mean a kind of populism? Does it mean right-wing libertarianism? I'm operating with a model of conservatism that sees it as something that respects tradition, respects natural limits, respects traditional institutions, and sees those things as having an authority that transcends that of the individual and require the individual to conform to some degree to those things. I suspect the kind of conservatism that a gay conservative would hold to would have to tilt more in a radical libertarian kind of direction. Now, whether one calls that conservatism or not might be a matter of linguistic choice, but it's not the traditional form of conservatism that we find in an Edmund Burke, or we find most beautifully articulated, I think, in our generation in the writings of Sir Roger Scruton, the great English philosopher. So, yeah, it may depend on how you define conservatism, but to me, a conservatism that has no respect for natural limits, for traditions, no respect for authority, no desire to see change done only incrementally is not really a true conservatism.
Now, Carl, to your point, and I agree with you that there may not be a shared definition of conservatism anymore and what a conservative is. But I think for Christians, it's more important that we not try to be conservative, but that we try to think like Christians. And the fact that we may not have a shared definition of what conservative means suggests there could be error in trying to be conservative. And there does seem to be some jockeying within political circles in some cases. We want to be the most conservative, or we want to be the least conservative. Is that problematic if we are trying to be more or less conservative rather than just trying to be biblical?
Yes, and I think that most obviously is exemplified by the uncritical attitude to voting. I've always said, that when a Christian goes to the polls and ticks one box or the other, it's always a trade-off. that we should never put our trust in princes. We should never uncritically follow one political leader or another. We've got to vote one way or the other. But we should always realize that as Christians, we sort of vote with dirty hands, if you like. Somebody's got to rule the country. We should have a say in that. But we should not so identify one figure or one party manifesto with the Christian faith that we end up secularizing the Christian faith. We end up tying the Christian faith to a deeply flawed human ideology at that point.
That's exactly the point we should end on here. Carl Trueman, we thank you so much for your time. And again, I'm going to encourage everybody to go get his latest book just out today, Strange New World. Get it wherever you get your books. Carl Trueman, you are a gift to all of us, and we appreciate your time today very much. Thanks for being with us.